Margaret Sullivan's fingers trembled as she gripped the grocery cart, her right leg throbbing with each step through the fluorescent-lit aisles. At 62, she'd mastered the art of hiding behind the tight smile, the measured breathing, the casual lean against the cart that looked natural but kept weight off her leg. For 38 years, she'd heard the same refrain, "Just arthritis, just your age. Maybe it's all in your head." Mrs. Sullivan. She'd learned to believe them, learned to live with the constant ache radiating from her pelvis down through her thigh, learned to dismiss her own body's desperate signals. That evening, while stirring spaghetti sauce for her son's family, the pain would become unbearable. She would collapse on her kitchen floor, sauce spreading across the tiles like blood, and in the harsh lights of St. Mary's emergency room, doctors would finally discover what had been inside her body all along, something that would expose a lie lasting nearly 4 decades. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Margaret Sullivan hadn't always been the woman who limped through grocery stores, rationing her energy like currency. Once, she'd been someone different entirely. At 62, her gray blonde hair fell in a practical bob that required minimal maintenance. She favored cardigan sweaters. Today's was blue, the same shade as her wedding dress from 40 years ago, and sensible shoes that couldn't quite mask her uneven gait. Her hands, worn from years of work as a medical billing clerk, showed every sacrifice she'd made. Widowed since 22 when her husband David's heart had simply stopped. She lived alone in their modest Wilmington, Delaware home, surrounded by photographs of happier times. Her son Michael, now 38, lived 20 minutes away with his wife Jennifer and 2 children, Emma, 8, and Noah, 6. Margaret tried to see them weekly, though lately she'd been canceling more often. The grandchildren had started asking questions she couldn't answer. Why does Grandma walk funny? Why doesn't she play with us anymore? Her bathroom cabinet told its own story, expired prescriptions stacked like archaeological layers, ice packs in the freezer, heating pads draped over chairs. She'd become an expert in pain management through trial and error, though nothing ever truly helped. But 38 years earlier, Margaret had been 24 and luminous with hope. She'd married David Sullivan straight out of high school, 2 kids who'd grown up in the same Newark neighborhood, sharing dreams over diner coffee. By 24, she was 7 months pregnant with their first child, working as a dental receptionist, painting the nursery yellow in their small apartment. Life felt limitless. January 15, 1986 had started like any ordinary day. David kissed her goodbye that morning before his shift at the DuPont factory. Her prenatal appointment at 2 p.m. brought reassuring news. "Everything looks perfect, Margaret. You're doing great." She remembered driving home on I-9 as darkness fell early on that winter afternoon. Sam Cooke's "You Send Me" played on the radio. Her hand rested on her belly, feeling the baby kick. Her copy of What to Expect When You're Expecting sat on the passenger seat, bookmarked at the chapter on labor and delivery. Then came the sound, a truck horn blaring impossibly loud, a semi-truck jackknifing across lanes, her hands wrenching the wheel, the sickening crunch of metal against guardrail, glass shattering, the world spinning. Her last conscious thought before everything went dark: "Save my baby." She woke up 3 days later to learn she had a son, What she didn't know was that something had been left behind during the emergency surgery, something that would haunt her for the next 38 years. The operating room at St. Mary's Hospital hummed with controlled urgency. As midnight approached, Dr. Thomas Brennan, 38, and into his 14th hour of shift, scrubbed his hands with mechanical precision. This was his second emergency of the night, a pregnant woman and her unborn child, both in jeopardy. Margaret Sullivan lay unconscious on the table, her abdomen swollen with pregnancy and trauma. Two surgical teams worked simultaneously in the cramped space, obstetrics and orthopedics, racing against time. "Sponge count," a nurse called out, her voice cutting through the tension. 14 in, doctor." Dr. Brennan barely registered the words. His focus narrowed to the incision, the blood, the baby's heartbeat fading on the monitor. At 11:58 p.m., he delivered a crying infant boy. The sound filled the room, life persisting against odds. In the waiting room, David Sullivan heard his son's cry and collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief. But Margaret's crisis wasn't over. Her pelvis had shattered on impact. Fragments of bone embedded in muscle and tissue, internal bleeding pooled in her abdomen. While nurses whisked the newborn to the NICU, Dr. Brennan and the orthopedic team worked to reconstruct what the accident had destroyed. Surgical sponges, small squares of gauze used to absorb blood and keep the surgical field clear, were packed into the cavity. One here, another there, soaking up fluid, maintaining visibility. The surgery stretched into early morning hours. Metal plates, screws, careful reconstruction of fractured bone. At 2:30 a.m., exhaustion pressed down on everyone in the room. "Sponge count," the nurse said again, consulting her checklist. 12 out, doctor. Doctor. Brennan's hands paused. 14 in, 12 out. The math was simple, but his mind was fog. He heard the baby crying down the hall, remembered the mother's pulse stabilizing, saw the neat rows of sutures closing the pelvic repair. "Close her up," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The nurse hesitated. "Doctor, should we—" "The baby's fine. Mother's stable. Close?" He stepped back from the table, peeling off his gloves. The nurse made a notation in the surgical record, but said nothing more. In 1986, you didn't question senior surgeons. Not when everyone was exhausted, not when a baby had been saved. 2 surgical sponges remained inside Margaret Sullivan's body, nestled deep in the pelvic reconstruction site. The metal plates and screws installed that night would eventually mask them in X-rays, creating shadows that looked like normal post-surgical changes. When Margaret woke, 3 days later, Dr. Brennan stood beside her bed with practiced reassurance. "You and your son are both fine. You'll have some pain from the injuries, but that's normal, perfectly normal." She believed him. Why wouldn't she? 38 years passed. On October 15th, 2024, Margaret stood in her kitchen as autumn darkness settled over Wilmington. The familiar pain in her right side had been worse all day, but she'd pushed through it. She always did. Michael and his family were coming for dinner spaghetti, her son's favorite, her mother's recipe that she'd made 1,000 times. The sauce simmered on the stove, filling the kitchen with the scent of tomatoes and garlic. The table was set for 5. Margaret wore her blue cardigan, the comfortable one that felt like an old friend. At 6:47 p.m., pain struck like lightning through her pelvis, not the dull, constant ache she'd lived with for decades. This was different, sharp, vicious, stealing her breath. The wooden spoon clattered from her hand. She reached for the counter, fingers grasping at empty air. Her knees buckled. Margaret hit the kitchen floor hard, her head glancing off the table edge. The pot of sauce tipped, red liquid spreading across the white tile in a pattern that looked disturbingly like blood. Her phone sat on the counter, just beyond reach. She tried to crawl, but her right leg wouldn't respond. The kitchen swam in and out of focus, sounds becoming muffled and distant. The clock on the wall read 6:40, then 6:50, then 7:02. Michael's key turned in the front door at 7:15. His children's excited voices. Grandma's making spaghetti. Cut off abruptly. Mom! His footstep quickened. Mom! Sorry we're late. He rounded the corner into the kitchen and froze. Sauce everywhere. His mother on the floor, semi-conscious, one hand still outstretched toward the counter. Mom? He dropped to his knees beside her, his phone already in his hand. Mom, can you hear me? Behind him, his daughter. Emma screamed. Jennifer pulled the children back. Outside now, go. Michael's fingers shook as he dialed 911. My mother collapsed. There's blood everywhere. Please hurry. He knelt beside her, holding her hand, watching her eyes flutter, not knowing that inside her body, after 38 years, 2 forgotten surgical sponges had finally triggered a crisis that would change everything. The ambulance pulled into St. Mary's Hospital at 8:30 p.m., the same facility where Margaret had given birth 38 years earlier. The building had expanded since then, new wings added, old corridors renovated, but the emergency room entrance remained hauntingly familiar. Dr. Robert Chen stood at the nurse's station, reviewing charts as his shift neared its end. At 58, he'd seen thousands of emergency cases, developed instincts about which patients needed immediate intervention and which were less urgent. When Margaret's chart appeared on his screen, he scanned it quickly. 62-year-old female, history of chronic pain, multiple previous ER visits for similar complaints. His jaw tightened slightly. Another chronic pain patient. Another long night of someone seeking medication or attention. Margaret lay on the gurney in Bay 7. Michael pacing outside the thin curtain. Dr. Chen entered, his examination perfunctory, checking vital signs, palpating her abdomen with practiced hands. She winced when he pressed on her lower right side. Mrs. Sullivan, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your pain? 9, she whispered. Maybe 10. He typed something into his tablet without looking up. I see you've been here before. Multiple visits over the years for similar symptoms. This is different. Please, something's really wrong. We'll make you comfortable, he said, his tone suggesting he'd heard this before. I'm ordering IV fluids and pain management, likely a diverticulitis flare or IBS. We'll observe you for a few hours. Michael pushed through the curtain. Doctor, my mother collapsed. This isn't her normal pain. Chen's expression tightened defensively. Sir, I understand you're worried, but your mother has a documented history of chronic pain conditions. We need to rule out the most common causes first, but we'll take good care of her. He left before Michael could argue further. In the next bay, Dr. Elizabeth Harper overheard the exchange. At 33, She was in her first year after completing her residency, still carrying the idealism that medical school had tried to beat out of her. Something about Dr. Gorsuch-Chen's dismissive tone bothered her. During a break, she pulled up Margaret's full medical history on the computer. The pain had started in 1986, immediately following emergency surgery after a car accident. Extensive orthopedic hardware plates, screws installed during pelvic reconstruction. But when was the last time anyone had actually looked at that hardware? The most recent imaging was from 15 years ago. Elizabeth approached Dr. Chen at the nurse's station. "Dr. Chen, with respect, shouldn't we get updated imaging on Mrs. Sullivan?" He didn't look up from his paperwork. "Dr. Harper, it's 9 p.m. CT scans are expensive, and she's been stable for nearly 40 years. But she hasn't been stable. She's been in pain for nearly 40 years, which suggests chronic conditions, not acute pathology." Elizabeth held her ground. What if there's hardware failure or infection around the old surgical site? Dr. Chen sighed, closing his tablet. "If you want to order it under your name, your budget." 20 minutes later, Margaret was wheeled into the radiology suite. The C-scanner hummed and clicked, taking thin-slice images of her pelvis and abdomen. Michael waited outside, his head in his hands, whispering prayers he hadn't spoken since his father's death. In the radiology reading room, technician James Morrison reviewed the images with practiced eyes. 20 years of experience meant he knew normal anatomy, knew what hardware looked like, knew when something was off. He zoomed in on the pelvic area. Metal plates and screws appeared as expected, bright white on the scan. But two other objects caught his attention: wrong density for tissue, wrong shape for hardware, rectangular, roughly 4 inches by 4 inches, with small metallic markers embedded in them. "What the hell?" he muttered, measuring them on screen. He'd seen something like this before, years ago. Retained surgical objects, but 2 of them. After 38 years, he grabbed the phone. "Harper, you need to see this, now." Elizabeth arrived within minutes. James pointed to the screen, his finger tracing the outline of the objects. "These aren't hardware. Look at the density. Look at the shape." Elizabeth leaned closer, her medical training clicking into place. The objects had radiopaque strips markers used in surgical sponges to make them visible on X-rays. "Oh my God, are those surgical sponges? That's what they look like to me." Elizabeth checked Margaret's records again. Last surgery, January 15th, L86. The emergency C-section and pelvic reconstruction, 38 years ago. Her hands started shaking. 38 years. They've been inside her for 38 years. She grabbed the tablet and rushed to find Dr. Chen. He was documenting another patient's discharge, ready to go home. "Dr. Chen, we need to talk. Immediately." Something in her voice made him look up. She thrust the tablet toward him, images pulled up. "Mrs. Sullivan has foreign objects in her pelvis, surgical sponges from her 1986 surgery." His face drained of color. For a moment, the professional mask slipped, revealing shock. Then it returned. Could be artifact, calcification that looks like, you know what those are. A heavy silence fell between them. Finally, he nodded. "Call surgery. Get Dr. Morgan." And He hesitated. Call hospital administration. Administration, why? Just do it, Dr. Harper. Elizabeth returned to Margaret's bay, her heart pounding. Michael stood immediately when he saw her expression. What is it? She sat down on the edge of the bed, taking Margaret's hand. Mrs. Sullivan, we found something on your scan, something that shouldn't be there. She turned the tablet screen toward them. These appear to be surgical sponges. From your emergency surgery in 1986. Margaret stared at the images, not comprehending at first. Inside me for 38 years? Elizabeth said softly. Michael's voice cracked. You mean she's been right all along and nobody listened? Margaret's breathing quickened. Memories flooding back every doctor's appointment where she'd been dismissed, every time someone suggested the pain was psychosomatic, every moment she'd doubted her own body. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth whispered. We're taking you to surgery right now. We're going to fix this. But as she spoke, she noticed 2 men in suits entering the ER, speaking quietly with chin. One was checking his watch, the other making notes on a legal pad. Michael saw them too. Who are they? Elizabeth didn't answer, but her expression said everything. The hospital's response had already begun, not with apology, but with damage control. At 2:00 a.m. on October 16th, Margaret was wheeled into operating room 3. Michael sat alone in the surgical waiting area, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. He couldn't stop thinking about his childhood, his mother limping through his baseball games, leaving parent-teacher conferences early with a hand pressed to her side, the way she'd gripped the arms of chairs when the pain hit. All those years, she'd been telling the truth to Patricia Morgan, the hospital's chief of general surgery, reviewed the CT images one final time before scrubbing in. At 52, she'd performed thousands of surgeries, but this case unsettled her. Retained foreign objects happened rarely, but they happened. But 2 sponges, undiscovered for 38 years, that suggested something more than a simple mistake. On the operating table, Margaret lay unconscious as the anesthesia took hold. Dr. Morgan made her first incision along the old scar line from 1986, the tissue beneath, resistant and tough. 38 years of the body trying to heal around objects that shouldn't be there had created layers of scar tissue like hardened leather. She cut deeper, exposing the pelvic area where the original reconstruction had been performed. The metal plates and screws installed decades ago remained in place, corroded slightly, but functional. Around them, she found what she was looking for. The first surgical sponge was embedded in muscle tissue, encapsulated by the body's desperate attempt to wall off the foreign object. A chronic abscess had formed around it, infected, contained, but constantly inflaming the surrounding tissue. Dr. Morgan carefully peeled away the adhesions, each layer revealing how long this had been festering. When she finally extracted it, the sponge was discolored, yellow-brown, partially decomposed, emanating a foul odor that made the surgical nurse gag. But it was still identifiable, a standard 4x4 surgical gauze with a radiopaque strip woven through it. Faintly visible along one edge was a logo, St. Mary's Hospital Supply. Document everything, Dr. Morgan said quietly. Photographs, measurements, chain of custody. This is evidence. The second sponge lay deeper, near the original pelvic repair site. This one had caused nerve compression, the source of Margaret's radiating leg pain for nearly 4 decades. It was better preserved, more intact, the hospital logo still clearly visible. The extraction took 3 hours. When both sponges lay in a sterile specimen tray, Morgan stared at them for a long moment. Someone had counted wrong in 1980s. Or worse, someone had counted correctly and ignored the discrepancy. In the recovery room at 5:30 a.m., Margaret's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she felt was different pain, sharp, surgical, fresh, but underneath it, the absence of something she'd carried for so long, she'd forgotten what life felt like without it. Michael was allowed in moments later. His mother looked small and pale against the white sheets, but her eyes were clear. "They got them out. Mom, they're gone." Tears ran down Margaret's face. 38 years, Michael, 38 years. I thought I was weak, that I couldn't handle pain like other people. Morgan entered carrying a clear medical bag containing both sponges. She placed it on the bedside table without comment. Margaret stared at the objects that had stolen so much of her life, her ability to play with her son, to dance at her wedding anniversary, to live without constant suffering. Michael photographed them with his phone, just in case, he said, though he wasn't sure yet what he meant. 4 hours later, Margaret was barely awake when her room door opened. Hospital Administrator Richard Thornton entered with a woman in an expensive suit, Amanda Ross, the hospital's corporate defense attorney. Neither carried flowers or offered the condolences one might expect after discovering a nearly 4-decade-old medical error. Thornton was all business. "Mrs. Sullivan, we're terribly sorry for this unfortunate situation." Margaret blinked, still foggy from anesthesia. Amanda Ross placed a leather folder on the bedside table. "We'd like to resolve this matter quickly and fairly, for everyone's benefit." She opened the folder to reveal a settlement agreement. The number at the top made Michael's breath catch. $2 million, complete medical care, all expenses paid. But as his eyes scanned down the page, he saw the conditions: non-disclosure agreement, no public discussion of the case, no contact with media, no contact with other patients, cannot review full medical records, must sign within 48 hours or the offer expires. "You're asking her to sign this now?" Michael's voice rose. "She just woke up from surgery." "We're trying to be generous," Thornton replied smoothly. "This is complicated, and we want to avoid making it more difficult for Mrs. Sullivan." "More difficult?" Michael stood. "You left surgical equipment inside her for 38 years, and you're worried about things being difficult." Amanda's expression remained neutral. "Mr. Sullivan, this is more than fair compensation. Most malpractice cases settle for significantly less. The offer expires October 18th at 10 a.m. That's 48 hours. They left the materials on the table and exited before Michael could respond. Over the next 24 hours, Margaret's room phone rang every 2 to 3 hours. Different voices, same message. "Just checking if you've made a decision. This is very generous. You should consider it carefully. We'd hate for you to miss this opportunity." Finally, Michael unplugged the phone. "Don't sign anything, Mom. Something's not right about this." That night, while Margaret slept, Michael sat in her hospital room with his laptop. He started with simple searches. Retained surgical sponge lawsuited. Mary's hospital malpractice. Thomas Brennan. The results were surprisingly sparse. A few sealed settlement cases. No public complaints for a surgeon with a 40-year career. Brennan's record appeared suspiciously clean. Not perfect, but too clean. Michael had worked in quality control long enough to know that absence of problems often meant problems were being hidden. He drove to the Delaware courthouse on October 18th and spent 6 hours in the records department searching civil case filings. What he found made his hands shake. 12 sealed settlement cases involving St. Mary's Hospital, spanning from 1989 to 24, specifically named Dr. Thomas Brennan as the defendant. All settled before trial, all terms confidential. But plaintiff names appeared on the public docket sheets they had to, by law. Michael wrote them down: Sarah Mitchell, Linda Patterson, Patricia Donovan, and 9 others. He returned home and began the painstaking work of finding these women through social media, white pages, and LinkedIn. On October 19th, he called Sarah Mitchell. A woman answered, her voice cautious. "Hello, Miss Mitchell. My name is Michael Sullivan. This is going to sound strange, but were you a patient of Thomas Brennan at St. Mary's Hospital?" A long silence. "I can't talk about that. I signed papers. My mother just had 2 surgical sponges removed from her body. They'd been inside her for 38 years. From a 1986 surgery, Brennan performed." Another silence, then the sound of crying. "Mine was 1989. They found the sponge 6 years later, in 1995. The hospital paid me $500,000 and made me sign an NDA. They told me I was the only one. They said it was a one-time mistake." "You're not the only one," Michael said. "Can we meet?" They met at a coffee shop in Wilmington on October 21st. Sarah Mitchell was 60 years old, well-dressed, but her hands trembled as she held her coffee cup. She brought her sealed settlement agreement, old medical records, and photographs of her surgical site. "I had a C-section in 1989, she explained. "I was 25. The pain started till immediately, but they said it was normal healing. It took 6 years before someone finally did an MRI and found the sponge. By then, I'd been told so many times it was in my head that I'd started to believe it." Michael showed her the photographs of his mother's sponges. Sarah stared at them, tears streaming down her face. Same hospital, same doctor. "How many more are there?" "Over the next week." Michael created a private Facebook group and posted carefully worded messages in local community forums. "If you had surgery at St. Mary's Hospital between 1980 and 2005 and experienced chronic unexplained pain afterward, please contact me." Within 72 hours, 15 women responded. Not all involved retained sponges. Some had experienced other complications, but 7 specifically described foreign objects discovered years after surgery. All 7 had been operated on by Dr. Brennan. All had settled with non-disclosure agreements. All had been told they were the only one. On October 30th, they gathered at Margaret's house. She'd been discharged from the hospital 3 days earlier, still recovering but insistent on hosting. Her living room filled with women aged 55 to 70. each carrying folders of medical records, settlement agreements, and the weight of years spent in silence. Linda Patterson, 65, had undergone a hysterectomy in 1990. A sponge was found in 2001, but by then the chronic infection had destroyed her fertility. The hospital paid her $700 to douse her husband had left her before the discovery, convinced she was a hypochondriac seeking attention. Patricia Donovan, 63, had an appendectomy in 1999. The sponge wasn't found until 2010. She settled for $1.2 million but lost her marriage and a decade of her life to pain no one believed. Story after story, each woman sharing the same experience, years of being dismissed, doctors suggesting anxiety or depression, the profound relief of finally being believed, and then the enforced silence of a settlement agreement. "They offered me $2 million, Margaret said quietly. 48-hour deadline. I didn't sign. The room fell silent. Sarah Mitchell spoke first. I wish I'd been that brave. I'm not brave, Margaret replied. I'm just... If I stay quiet, he keeps operating. If I take the money and disappear, this keeps happening to other women. Michael leaned forward. Some of you can't speak because of your NDAs, but Mom hasn't signed anything yet. If she goes public, the truth comes out. You're already bound by your agreements, but at least the truth is finally told. One by one, the women agreed to support Margaret however they could. Even if they couldn't speak publicly, they could attend court proceedings. They could sit in the gallery as silent witnesses. They could let Margaret tell the story that had been stolen from all of them. Patricia Donovan wiped her eyes. You're giving us a second chance to do the right thing. On October 31st, Margaret called Richard Thornton from her home phone. Her voice was steady. Mr. Thornton, I'm declining your settlement offer. Mrs. Sullivan, I strongly advise you to reconsider. I'm going to find a lawyer, and we're going public. A pause. That would be very unwise. We'll be forced to defend ourselves vigorously. Then defend yourselves. She hung up. Michael stood nearby, proud and terrified. Mom, are you sure? For 38 years, I wasn't sure of anything. I'm sure now. Finding representation proved difficult. 5 local malpractice attorneys declined the case. St. Mary's was too powerful, too well connected. Finally, Michael found Rebecca Chen, a Philadelphia attorney known for taking difficult cases that other lawyers avoided. She drove to Wilmington that afternoon, reviewed the evidence spread across Margaret's dining room table, medical records, photographs of the sponges. Michael's research on the other victims, settlement agreements the women had shared. This isn't just malpractice, Rebecca said slowly. This is systematic cover-up. We're not just suing for negligence. We're exposing a pattern. How do we start? Margaret asked. Rebecca looked at her client, a 62-year-old widow who'd suffered in silence for 38 years and now refused to be quiet any longer. With the truth, a press conference. Are you ready for that? Margaret thought. About the 7 women who'd sat in her living room, sharing stories of pain and cats. She thought about the 38 years stolen from her. She thought about how many more women might be suffering right now, being told their pain wasn't real. I'm ready. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. on November 3rd at Rebecca Chen's law office in Philadelphia. Margaret had expected a handful of local reporters. Instead, 30 media outlets crowded into the small conference room. Someone had leaked the story on social media, and it had already begun spreading. Margaret wore her blue cardigan and reading glasses, her hands shaking as she gripped her prepared statement. Michael and Jennifer sat on either side of her. At the back of the room, 7 women sat in silent solidarity. Sarah, Linda, Patricia, and the others who couldn't speak but could witness. On the table in front of Margaret sat a clear evidence bag containing 2 discolored surgical sponges. She cleared her throat and began, "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 62 years old. For 38 years, I've been in pain." Her voice wavered slightly, but she continued, describing the 1986 accident, the emergency surgery, the decades of chronic agony, doctor after doctor telling her it was normal. It was her age. It was stress. It was in her head. Then she lifted the evidence bag. Camera shutters clicked like rainfall. This is what was in my head. 2 surgical sponges left inside my body during emergency surgery in 1986 at St. Mary's Hospital. She let the cameras capture the image before continuing, "The hospital offered me $2 million to stay quiet. I declined because I discovered I'm not alone. There are other women who suffered, who were dismissed, who were silenced with money and legal agreements." Her hands steadied as she spoke. "This isn't about compensation. This is about truth, about making sure no other woman spends 4 decades in pain because no one will believe her." During the question and answer session, a reporter asked, "What was the worst part?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was not being believed. It was doubting my own body. It was thinking I was weak when I was actually fighting an infection for 38 years." Within 2 hours, the story was trending on social media. By evening, national news networks had picked it up. The hashtag #HatBelieve, women's pain, exploded across platforms, with thousands of women sharing their own stories of medical dismissal. Not all involved surgical errors, but all shared the same theme: doctors not listening, pain not believed, women told they were exaggerating or imagining their suffering. The next afternoon, St. Mary's Hospital held its own press conference. The stage was set with corporate precision. CEO Martin Westfield flanked by the chief of surgery, 8 attorneys, and a PR team. Everything polished, professional, defensive. "We deeply regret Mrs. Sullivan's experience," Westfield began, reading from a prepared statement. "However, this was an isolated incident from nearly 4 decades ago. Medical practices have changed dramatically since 1980s. We have robust safety protocols in place today." Then came the subtle shift in tone. "Mrs. Sullivan has a complex medical history, including documented anxiety disorder and chronic pain conditions. We offered a generous settlement, which she chose to reject in favor of pursuing media attention." The implication was clear, but perhaps she wasn't entirely credible. Over the next week, the hospital's counterattack intensified. Margaret's medical records were leaked to sympathetic media outlets, a HIPAA violation that would be impossible to prove. Headlines began appearing: "Woman suing hospital has history of mental health treatment. Chronic pain patient seeks millions in controversial case." Anonymous social media accounts flooded comment sections with coordinated messages. She's just after money. Why wait 38 years if it was really that bad? Probably trying to scam the system. Margaret sat in her living room, watching the evening news dissect her credibility. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through comments, calling her a liar, a fraud, mentally unstable. Michael paced behind her, furious. "They're doing it again," Margaret whispered, not believing me, just like before. "We should sue for defamation," Michael said. Rebecca shook her head. "We fight this in court, not in the media. They're trying to provoke us into making mistakes. Don't take the bait." On November 10th, the hospital filed a countersuit defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking $10 million in damages. They claimed Margaret's public statements had damaged the hospital's reputation and caused financial harm. The media narrative shifted again. Hospital sues woman who went public about medical error. Public opinion, which had been wavering, swung back toward Margaret. People began questioning why a hospital would sue a victim rather than simply apologize. That same week, Dr. Elizabeth DeHarper made a decision that would change everything. She'd been watching the news coverage with growing disturbance. She knew the hospital's narrative didn't match what she'd seen in Margaret's case. Something was wrong with their version of events. The claim that this was an isolated incident from decades ago. On November 4th, at 10 p.m., Elizabeth used her hospital credentials to access the medical records archive in the basement. The area was rarely visited, filled with file cabinets containing paper records from before the hospital went digital. She told herself she was just looking, just confirming her suspicions. In a locked cabinet labeled Quality Assurance Confidential, she found what she was looking for: incident reports dating back to 1980. Retained foreign object appeared 27 times over 40 years. Most involved Dr. Brennan. All had been settled quietly, with non-disclosure agreements. Elizabeth photographed everything with her phone, then took the original documents. She knew she was committing theft, possibly criminal trespass. Her career was over the moment she walked out with those files. But she also knew she couldn't stay silent. She drove straight to Rebecca Chen's office, arriving near midnight with a banker's box full of evidence. Rebecca scheduled another press conference for November 50. This time, Elizabeth stood at the podium, presenting the document she'd found. 27 cases, 40 years, a pattern of negligence systematically covered up. The story exploded. Politicians called for investigations. Medical licensing boards announced reviews. The hashtag expanded to #HospitalCoverUp. St. Mary's stock price dropped 15% in 2 days. But Elizabeth paid the price. The hospital fired her immediately, announcing that she'd violated patient privacy and security protocols. They threatened criminal prosecution for theft of confidential documents. She was blacklisted from other Delaware hospitals overnight. At her small apartment that evening, Elizabeth stared at her medical school diploma, $200,000 in debt, no job prospects, possibly facing charges. Her phone rang. It was Margaret. "I saw what they did to you. I'm so sorry." "Don't be," Elizabeth replied, though her voice shook. "I made my choice. I just hope it was worth it. It was. You believed me when no one else would. That's worth everything." On December 15th, The trial began at Delaware Superior Court in Wilmington. Outside, protesters lined the courthouse steps, some holding signs reading, "Believe Women and Healthcare Accountability," others with, "Don't Destroy Our Hospital and Jobs Matter." St. Mary's employed 2,000 people. This case threatened the institution itself. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled. Margaret sat at the defendant's table with Rebecca. Across the aisle, 8 lawyers in expensive suits represented St. Mary's. Brennan sat separately, with his own counsel, a frail-looking man of 68 with white hair, who could have been anyone's grandfather. The 7 women from the support group filled the front row of the gallery. Michael and his family sat behind them. Media filled the remaining seats. Judge Patricia Reynolds, who happened to be 62 Margaret's age, entered and called the court to order. The hospital's lead attorney, Vincent Caruso, delivered the opening statement with practiced confidence. "Yes, Your Honor, a mistake was made in 1980s. Medicine wasn't perfect then, but Mrs. Sullivan chose to make this a public spectacle rather than accept fair compensation. She's not seeking justice. She's seeking fame and fortune." He displayed Margaret's Facebook profile, showing posts she'd liked and shared. She claims 38 years of debilitating pain, yet she worked full-time, raised a son, and lived a relatively normal life. If the pain was truly severe, why didn't she seek second opinion sooner? Why didn't she demand more testing? The implication hung in the air. Maybe the pain wasn't as bad as she claimed. Maybe this was about money after all. Rebecca's opening was simpler, more direct. She pointed at Margaret, members of the jury. "Look at this woman, 62 years old, a widow, a grandmother. She's not here for fame. She's here because for 38 years she was told she was imagining things." Rebecca held up the evidence bag containing the sponges. "These are real. The pain was real. The dismissals were real. St. Mary's Hospital didn't just make a mistake in 1986. They made a choice to hide it. And we're going to prove they've been hiding mistakes for 40 years. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, ages ranging from 28 to 70, watched intently. Several looked at Margaret with sympathy. The first week of testimony focused on medical experts. The hospital's witnesses argued that retained sponges, while regrettable, were a known complication. Standards in 1986 were different. Emergency surgeries carried inherent risks. Zero error rates were impossible to guarantee. Rebecca's experts countered that sponge counts were basic protocol even in nights. Losing 1 sponge might be excusable in extreme circumstances. Losing 2 was negligence. The 38 years of chronic infection and inflammation proved the sponges had been causing continuous damage. The most powerful testimony came from Dr. James Morrison, a retired surgeon with 40 years of experience. "In my entire career, I never lost a single sponge. Not one. It's inexcusable. The protocols exist for exactly this reason." On December 20th, Margaret took the stand. Caruso tried to rattle her, asking about her medication history, her anxiety prescriptions, her therapy sessions. "Isn't it true you've been prescribed psychiatric medication?" "Yes," Margaret replied steadily. "Because doctors told me the pain was in my head. When you're told repeatedly that you're imagining things, you start to wonder if something's wrong with your mind. Isn't it true you visited the emergency room numerous times over the years? Yes, because I was in pain, real pain. Why didn't you demand more testing, more aggressive investigation? Margaret's voice broke slightly. I trusted my doctors. I was raised to trust authority figures. It never occurred to me that they'd left something inside me. Why would it? I thought something was wrong with me, that I couldn't handle pain like other people, that I was weak. Several jurors nodded. One woman in the front row wiped her eyes. Caruso pressed harder. You're seeking $15 million in this lawsuit, correct? I'm seeking accountability. My lawyer determined the amount based on damages. But isn't this really about money? You rejected a generous $2 million settlement. Margaret looked directly at him. If this was about money, I would have taken the $2 million and stayed quiet. I'm here because staying quiet means this keeps happening. And I won't let another woman spend 40 years in pain because she's not believed. The courtroom was silent. Even Caruso seemed momentarily at a loss for words. That evening, Margaret sat in her hotel room with Michael, exhausted from the cross-examination. Do you think they believe me? Mom, everyone believes you. The question is whether they'll hold the hospital accountable. Margaret looked out the window at the courthouse across the street, lit up against the December darkness. I just want this to mean something. I want it to matter that we told the truth. It already matters, Michael said. Look at how many women have come forward because of you. Look at Elizabeth, risking everything. The truth is already changing things. But neither of them knew that the next day would bring testimony that would change everything in ways they couldn't predict. December 21st brought a development that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, Vincent Caruso announced, the defense calls Thomas Brennan to the stand. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Brennan testifying for the defense. Rebecca Chen's head snapped up, her mind racing through the implications. This wasn't standard strategy. Brennan walked slowly to the witness stand. Each step deliberate. At 68, he looked every year of his age, white hair, trembling hands, stooped shoulders. He could have been anyone's beloved grandfather. That, Margaret realized with growing dread, was exactly the point. Brennan, Caruso began gently, how long did you practice medicine? 42 years. His voice quavered. Until this lawsuit ended my career. Would you say it was a successful career? I delivered over 5,000 babies. I saved countless lives. I dedicated everything to my patients. Caruso presented exhibits, thank you cards from grateful families, photographs of Brennan holding newborns, letters praising his skill and compassion. The jury saw a man who devoted his life to healing, not harming. Dr. Brennan, did you make a mistake in Mrs. Sullivan's 1986 surgery? Brennan's eyes filled with tears. Yes, the worst mistake of my life. I think about it every single day. I've carried this guilt for 38 years. His voice broke. If I could take Mrs. Sullivan's pain and carry it myself, I would. I'm so sorry, God. I'm so sorry. He wept openly. Several jurors looked uncomfortable, sympathetic. Margaret felt sick watching the performance, if that's what it was. She couldn't tell anymore. Caruso let the moment settle before continuing. Brennan has suffered too, hasn't he? He's lost his career, his reputation, his legacy. At 68, facing retirement in disgrace, isn't that punishment enough? Rebecca's cross-examination was sharp, but the damage was done. Dr. Brennan, you said you've thought about this mistake for 38 years. That means you knew the sponges were left inside. I suspected, but I wasn't certain. Did you ever call Mrs. Sullivan in for a follow-up x-ray to check? No. Did you ever review the surgical notes where the sponge count didn't match? Brennan hesitated. It was so long ago, I can't recall specifically. Did you tell anyone, your supervisor, risk management, the medical board? No. So, for 38 years, you suspected you'd left foreign objects inside a patient, and you did nothing to verify or correct it. Healance. But the jury had already seen him cry. They'd seen him as human, flawed, suffering. Margaret could see it in their faces, some still sympathetic to her, but others now conflicted. Maybe both people were victims here. The next day, Elizabeth Harper took the stand for the defense, or rather, as Rebecca's witness. She carried the documents she'd found in the hospital archives, 27 cases of retained foreign objects over 40 years, 19 involving Brennan, all settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. The hospital's attorneys erupted. Objection. These documents were obtained illegally. Harper committed theft and violated security protocols. Judge Reynolds examined the documents carefully. The court notes the problematic acquisition. However, the documents appear authentic and relevant. I'll allow them as evidence, but the jury should consider the circumstances of their procurement. It was a partial victory, but Elizabeth knew what it meant. She'd been fired that morning, hospital security escorting her from the building as television cameras filmed. The hospital's official statement called her termination necessary due to serious violations of patient privacy and security protocols. They were considering criminal charges. During the lunch recess, Elizabeth sat on a bench outside the courthouse, suddenly understanding the full weight of her decision. $200,000 in medical school debt, no job, blacklisted from every hospital in Delaware, possibly facing prosecution. Her phone rang. Margaret's name appeared on the screen. "I saw what they did to you," Margaret said. "Elizabeth, I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "No." Elizabeth's voice shook despite her words. "I made my choice. I knew the risks. She paused. "I hope it was worth it." "It was," Margaret said firmly. "You believed me when no one else would. You gave me back something I'd lost faith, that some people still care about the truth. Gee, that's worth everything." But sitting alone after the call ended, Elizabeth wasn't sure she believed it. The trial recessed for Christmas, scheduled to resume January 5th. Margaret returned home to a neighborhood divided. Some houses displayed signs of support. Others avoided eye contact when she checked her mail. One neighbor confronted her directly. "You're going to shut down the hospitals. People will lose their jobs because of you." Media vans camped outside her house. Her phone rang constantly. Death threats mixed with messages of support. "You're destroying our community. Thank you for speaking up. You should be ashamed. You're a hero." On Christmas Eve, Michael's family came for dinner. Margaret tried to create normalcy for her grandchildren, but 8-year-old Emma saw through it. "Grandma, why are people being mean to you?" Margaret couldn't answer without crying. She excused herself to the kitchen, gripping the counter as tears fell. After the children were in bed, she sat with Michael in the living room. "Maybe I should have taken the money. Mom, this is hurting you, hurting the kids. Elizabeth lost her career because of me. What if we lose? What if it was all for nothing?" "You don't mean that." But Margaret did. For the first time since this began, she felt the crushing weight of doubt. 38 years of being told she was wrong, that she should stay quiet, that she was causing trouble, all of it came flooding back. On December 26th, a FedEx envelope arrived. Inside was a letter from the hospital's legal team and a new settlement offer, $5 million. Public apology, promised hospital reforms, no admission of guilt. The offer would expire January 3rd at 5 p.m. Margaret sat at her kitchen table as darkness fell, reading the letter over and over. $5 million. Security for Michael and the grandchildren. An end to the media circus. No more threats. No more being called a liar and a fraud. She could make this all go away. Take the money. Let someone else fight the fight. She sat there all night, the letter in her hands, watching the numbers on the microwave clock change. 11 to 7 p. Midnight, 1:50 a.m., 3:30 by dawn. She still hadn't decided. On January 2nd, Horrified, Rebecca Chen arrived at her Philadelphia office to find a FedEx package waiting on her desk. There was no return address, just her name and the law firm's address, printed in generic block letters. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note on plain paper. "I worked at St. Mary's Hospital for 35 years. I couldn't stay silent anymore. Use these to find the truth. A friend." Rebecca plugged the USB drive into her computer. What she found made her hands shake. Email chains between hospital administrators spanning from 1986 to 2024. Risk management reports flagging Dr. Brennan as high risk since 1992. Financial records showing settlements totaling $14.5 million over 40 years. Internal memos discussing how to manage the Brennan situation without damaging the hospital's revenue stream. One memo from 1987 was particularly damning. "Recommend removing Dr. Brennan from emergency rotation pending investigation of surgical count discrepancies." The response from the hospital's CFO, Dr. Brennan generates approximately $2 million in annual revenue. Continue monitoring, but retain on full schedule. But the most devastating evidence came from a 2010 email chain. The risk manager had written, "Dr. Brennan now has 3 additional potential retained object cases under review. Given the pattern, should we take action?" The CEO at the time, Martin Westfield, had responded, "Settle the cases quietly. Brennan is 6 years from retirement. We can manage this until then." They had known, not just suspected known, and they'd chosen to do nothing. Rebecca immediately hired a forensic analyst to verify the document's authenticity. Every email address checked out. Every letterhead matched hospital records. The metadata confirmed the dates and times. This wasn't fabricated. This was real. She also hired a private investigator to trace the package's origin. The FedEx tracking led to a mail service center near the hospital. Security footage showed An elderly woman, too, face partially covered by a scarf, paying cash. No identification, no way to trace her. We may never know who sent this, the investigator said, but whoever she is, she waited a long time to do the right thing. Rebecca worked through the night, organizing the evidence, preparing her strategy. This changed everything. This was no longer just about medical malpractice. This was about institutional corruption, about profit over patients, about a systematic cover-up that had lasted decades. On January 5th, the trial resumed. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew something had happened during the break, though few knew what. "Your Honor," Rebecca announced, "the plaintiff has obtained new evidence that fundamentally changes the nature of this case. She submitted the USB drive's contents, along with the forensic analyst's authentication report. The hospital's legal team erupted in objections, demanding to know the source, questioning Verheyen of custody, requesting an immediate continuance. Judge Reynolds reviewed the evidence carefully, then denied the continuance. These documents appear authentic and highly relevant. We're finishing this trial. The jury can consider any concerns about provenance in their deliberations." Rebecca called Martin Westfield to the stand. The CEO, who hadn't expected to testify, walked to the witness box with visible tension. His corporate polish was already cracking. "Mr. Westfield, are you familiar with these emails?" Rebecca displayed the 2010 exchange on the courtroom monitors. "I don't recall that specific." "That's your email address, your digital signature. You wrote, and I quote, 'Settle quietly. Brennan is 6 years from retirement. We can manage this.' Do you dispute writing that?" Westfield shifted uncomfortably. "That's taken out of context." "Then please provide the context where it's acceptable to keep a dangerous doctor practicing because he's close to retirement. We believed in rehabilitation, additional training. We wanted to help Dr. Brennan improve. Did he receive additional training after this email?" A pause. "No." "Did you restrict his surgical privileges?" "No." "Did you increase supervision of his procedures?" "No." "Did you report the pattern of retained foreign objects to the state medical board?" "No." "Why not?" "Mr. Westfield." The CEO struggled, searching for words that wouldn't incriminate him further. Finally, "Dr. Brennan was a valuable member of our medical staff." Rebecca let that sit for a moment. It's valuable, meaning he generated approximately $2 million in annual revenue for St. Mary's Hospital. That wasn't the only consideration, but it was a consideration. You weighed his revenue against patient safety, and you chose profit. Isn't that true? Westfield said nothing. "You chose profit over patients." "Mr. Westfield, that's what these emails prove." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Even the hospital's attorneys looked shaken. During the lunch recess, the defense team held an emergency meeting. Rebecca watched them through the courthouse window, arguing animatedly. She knew what they were debating: settle now and cut their losses, or continue and hope the jury wouldn't believe the emails. They chose to fight. That afternoon, they attacked the authenticity of the documents, the anonymous source, the lack of proper chain of custody. But Rebecca's forensic analyst testified for 2 hours, methodically proving that every email was genuine, traceable to hospital servers, and unaltered. The hospital's own IT director was forced to confirm their authenticity. In the gallery, the 7 women from Margaret's support group held hands, some crying quietly. They hadn't been isolated cases. They'd been documented, discussed, and deliberately dismissed. Patricia Donovan stood abruptly and walked out of the courtroom. Outside, surrounded by reporters, she spoke clearly into the microphones. I signed a non-disclosure agreement 12 years ago, but I'm breaking it right now. They knew. They knew we were suffering, and they didn't care because protecting their doctor was more profitable than protecting us. Within hours, 3 more women publicly broke their NDAs. The hospital threatened legal action, but the public backlash was immediate and fierce. Threatening victims who'd already suffered social media exploded with outrage. On January 7th, something unexpected happened. Dr. Brennan asked to return to the witness stand. His attorney tried to stop him. "Thomas, don't do this. You don't have to." "I need to," Brennan said quietly. Judge Reynolds looked surprised. "Dr. Brennan, you've already testified. Are you certain you wish to speak again?" "Yes, Your Honor. May I address Mrs. Sullivan directly?" The judge hesitated, then nodded. Brennan turned to face Margaret. His hands trembled on the railing. "Mrs. Sullivan, I lied to you before. When I said I only suspected, I knew. 3 days after your surgery, I knew." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. I reviewed the surgical notes. I saw the discrepancy, 14 sponges in, 12 out. I called you in for a follow-up appointment. Do you remember? Margaret nodded slowly, memory flooding back. You said everything looked fine. I lied. I was checking for symptoms, infection, inflammation. You mentioned pain, and I told you it was normal healing. When you left that day, I told myself that if there was serious infection, it would show up eventually. I'd deal with it then. His voice cracked. But weeks passed, months. You didn't come back with acute symptoms. I started telling myself maybe the sponges had dissolved somehow, or worked their way out, or... He shook his head. I told myself lies because I was terrified. He looked at the jury. I wasn't a monster. I was a coward. I had a family to support, a career I'd built. I'd just bought a house. I thought one mistake shouldn't destroy my entire life. But I destroyed yours instead. Margaret gripped the table edge, her knuckles white. When you came back over the years, Kitash, back in 2010 with chronic pain, I had so many chances to tell you the truth. Each time I chose silence. Because how do you tell someone you've let them suffer for a decade, 2 decades? It became impossible. He wiped his eyes. I kept operating because I told myself I was still doing good, delivering babies, saving lives. I balanced it in my head, one terrible mistake against thousands of successful procedures. But it was never one mistake. It was 38 years of choosing myself over you, over all of them. He gestured toward the 7 women in the gallery. I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you deserve the truth. Finally, the courtroom was absolutely silent at that. Then Margaret stood. Everyone watched as she walked slowly to the witness stand, facing the man who'd stolen 38 years of her life. Thank you, she said quietly, for finally telling the truth. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't give me back those years. But it matters that you said it." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "But I can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe not ever, because you're not the only one I'm here for." She turned and pointed to the 7 women. "You let this happen to them, too. You had chances to stop after me, but you didn't. Your suffering doesn't erase theirs." Margaret walked back to her seat. The courtroom remained silent. Even the judge seemed at a loss for words. It was the kind of moment that changes trials when raw truth cuts through legal maneuvering, and everyone present understands they're witnessing something rare complete: painful honesty. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Margaret, Michael, Rebecca, and the 7 women from the support group waited in the courthouse hallway, barely speaking. Elizabeth Harper sat with them, unemployed but present. At 4:30 p.m. on January 10th, 20 of the jury returned. "We find in favor of the plaintiff, Margaret Sullivan." The courtroom erupted. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaled a breath she'd been holding for 38 years. Michael wrapped his arms around his mother as she finally allowed herself to cry. The damages, $15 million in compensatory damages, plus $5 million in punitive damages against the hospital. But Judge Reynolds added more mandatory reforms that would reshape how St. Mary's operated. Cameras in all operating rooms, triple verification of surgical counts, annual public reporting of all surgical errors, independent oversight board with patient representatives. That Thomas Brennan's medical license was permanently revoked. Hospital executives named in the cover-up emails, including CEO Martin Westfield, were required to resign within 30 days. Most significantly, all previous non-disclosure agreements related to medical malpractice at St. Mary's were declared void. The 27 women could finally speak their truth. Margaret didn't celebrate. She simply stood, nodded to the 7 women in the gallery, and walked quietly from the courtroom. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but she had nothing to add. The verdict spoke for itself. The months that followed brought gradual healing. Margaret's physical pain didn't disappear completely. 38 years of chronic infection had caused permanent damage, but it was manageable now. Different. Most importantly, it was believed. In April, she experienced her first pain-free day. She'd been playing in the backyard with Emma and Noah, pushing them on the swing set, when she realized the constant ache was simply gone. She sat down on the porch steps and wept. The support group expanded beyond anyone's expectations. What started as 7 women in Margaret's living room grew to over 40 members meeting weekly at the community center. They called themselves Margaret's Circle, though Margaret insisted she wasn't a leader, just someone who'd spoken up when it mattered. National media coverage sparked a healthcare movement. Other hospitals voluntarily implemented similar reforms. Medical schools added new curriculum about listening to patients, particularly women reporting chronic pain. The hashtag #BelieveWomen'sPain became a permanent fixture in healthcare advocacy. On June 15th, Delaware governor signed Margaret's Law at a public ceremony. The legislation prohibited non-disclosure agreements in medical malpractice settlements, required public reporting of surgical errors, and protected healthcare whistleblowers from retaliation. Margaret stood beside the governor as he signed, with Elizabeth Harper on her other side. Elizabeth had received job offers from 3 major hospitals after the trial. Johns Hopkins hired her to direct their new patient advocacy program and teach medical ethics. "We need doctors willing to stand up for what's right," the department chair had said. July 20th, 2025, Margaret's 63rd birthday brought a backyard celebration. Michael and Jennifer, the grandchildren, the 7 women who'd become her closest friends. Elizabeth drove down from Baltimore, and one surprise guest, the elderly nurse who'd sent the USB drive, finally revealing herself. Her name was Dorothy Chen, age 68. She'd kept copies of the documents for decades, waiting for someone brave enough to use them. As the sun set over the backyard, Emma presented her grandmother with a handmade card, "To the bravest grandma in the world." Michael lit 63 candles on the cake. "Make a wish, Mom." Margaret looked around at the faces gathered, not just family, but a community built from shared truth and healing. "I already got my wish. I got to be believed, and I got to help others. That's worth the wait." She closed her eyes and blew out the candles, surrounded by love, finally free from the weight she'd carried for 38 years. The truth hadn't just freed her, it had changed the system that had failed so many. And in the end, that mattered more than anything. Margaret's story reminds us of something we often forget. Your pain is real, and you deserve to be heard. For too long, so many of us, especially women, have been told to stay quiet, to not make a fuss, to just accept things as they are. We've been dismissed by doctors, doubted by systems we trusted, and left to wonder if we were imagining our own suffering. But here's the truth that Margaret fought 38 years to prove speaking up matters. It's never too late to stand up for yourself. It's never too late to demand the truth. And most importantly, you're not alone. Every voice that refuses to stay silent makes it easier for the next person to be believed. Margaret didn't just win justice for herself. She changed the system for thousands of women who came after her. Her courage turned decades of pain into hope. And her refusal to accept money over truth created lasting change. What part of Margaret's journey resonated most deeply with you? Have you ever felt dismissed or unheard when you knew something was wrong? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story matters. And this community is here to listen and support each other.